Thank you, Amber. Thank you so much. Amber, if you haven't met Amber yet, this is your introduction to Amber. We are so grateful for Amber. She is the spiritual formation director here at Key City Church. And if you ever want to ask questions or get your questions answered about Key City Church, or you just want to figure out, like, how do I get plugged in here? How do I get connected here? Or questions about groups or anything like that, just find Amber. She is your go-to, and she will get you plugged in or help you take that step, that next step, whatever that might be for you. So thank you, Amber, and so glad you guys now know Amber and can seek her out for whatever you may need. There you go. Key City Church, welcome. It is so good to be with you guys this evening. We are so excited to be back together again. So excited to have those of you who are joining us online to be with us as well. But so excited, number one, because it's been so long since we've been together in person, and it feels so good just to be back together again. And we're also excited because this week we're kicking off a brand new message series, which will be a conversation that we're having over the next several weeks called Getting in the Way. And the reason that we're so excited about this conversation is because what we recognize is that the version of faith that you might have grown up with, or the version of faith that maybe was handed down to you, or the version of faith that you were first introduced to, was most likely a version of faith that had some kind of requirements and expectations. Right? Chances are the version of faith that you first were introduced to was a version of faith that had requirements and expectations. Things that were required of you, or things that were expected of you, and maybe requirements and expectations that came from God, requirements and expectations that came from a holy book or a scripture or a set of teachings, or requirements and expectations that came from a community, that there was a community that required things from you or expected things from you. Because most versions of faith have some kind of requirements and expectations. And requirements and expectations are things that all of us are very familiar with, because requirements and expectations are not peculiar to faith, right? We're exposed to requirements and expectations all over our lives, right? We're very familiar with these things because we have legal requirements and expectations, right? There are laws we have to follow. There are, with your job, there are requirements and expectations with your job that your boss requires of you, that he expects from you. Within your relationships, there are requirements and expectations with your spouse, your partner, your significant other. There are expectations in that relationship, some spoken, but how many of those expectations are completely unspoken? You just expect the other person to know what those expectations are. Requirements and expectations. Just about everywhere we turn around, we find requirements and expectations. So we're very, very familiar with requirements and expectations. Because we're so familiar with requirements and expectations, we know that requirements and expectations have implications. And one of those implications that we find in requirements and expectations is they tend to imply that I wouldn't comply, right? There's an implication there that these aren't things that I would just naturally do, because if I just naturally did them, they wouldn't have to be required or expected, right? I don't have to be required or expected to get a second dessert, right? I don't have to be required or expected to binge watch Netflix all night. I don't have to be required or expected to sleep in the next morning, right? The implication is that I wouldn't do these things naturally. And also, they tend to be done to satisfy someone, right? There are things that you tend to do to satisfy a who. That usually there's a who that's doing the requiring, or a who that's doing the expecting, right? There's someone on the other side of the requirement or expectation, but as their arms crossed and their foot tapping, right? Who's doing the requiring and the expecting. And because of that, what you have to do tends to be what you have to do in order to be approved, right? And that someone is basing their approval of you on your ability to meet that requirement or expectation. And your ability to meet that requirement or expectation tends to be something you do in order to be approved. Now, here's what we also know. And you know this because, you're as familiar with requirements and expectations as I am. They tend to get in the way of what we want to get, right? Requirements and expectations are things that stand between us often and the things that we want to get. They stand between us. They get in the way of what we want to get, or they get in the way of where we want to get. They're things that we'd rather do than satisfy requirements and expectations, right? Because if there weren't, we would just naturally do the requirements and expectations. But if we did that, we wouldn't need requirements and expectations. Requirements and expectations always get in the way of what we want to get. And if you grew up in a version of faith that consisted of requirements and expectations you're familiar with, and possibly somewhere along the way, in that version of faith, possibly you experienced that tension between the requirements and expectations and the things that you wanted to get, between the requirements and expectations and where you wanted to get. That maybe along the way you saw people who got to do things that you couldn't do because of the requirements and expectations which within the version of faith that you were introduced to. Along the way you saw people doing things that your requirements and expectations wouldn't allow you to do. You saw people spending their money in ways that you weren't really allowed to do because of your requirements and expectations. You saw people developing relationships that you didn't really get to have because of your requirements and expectations. That along the way, in that version of faith, you experienced this conflict, this tension, this pressure between what you wanted to get, between what you wanted to get were these requirements and expectations that tended to get in the way of what you wanted to get. And maybe for some of you, that tension, that pressure was the reason that you walked away. It might be the reason that you walked away, or maybe chose to never walk in to begin with. Now, we could spend the whole evening beating up on requirements and expectations, and I promise at the end of this, you can have the whole rest of your evening back to beat up on and just kick around requirements and expectations. But for right now, we're going to switch for a moment over to the other side of this equation for just a second to talk about what it is that we want to get. What we want to get. We're just going to get a little bit curious and do a little bit of exploration around those things that are the things that we want to get, the requirements and expectations so often get in the way of. Now, you guys know a lot about what you want to get, right? You're an expert on what you want to get. We're familiar with this. And so what I'm about to say, it's not going to be new to you, because you know this already. We're just going to articulate it, so we just all get on the same page. And one of the things that we all know about what we want to get is this. There is a want behind the want. Behind the things that we want to get, behind the things that you want to get, the things that you spend your time thinking about that you want to get, behind that there's a want. Because rarely is the thing that we want the thing that we want. Rarely are the outcomes that we want the thing that we want. Rarely is the end game that we're trying to get to. Rarely is that the thing we want. That usually behind that want, there's another want. And the way that we can discover what that other want is, and you can do this, is just to ask yourself the question about that want. You can ask yourself, why do I want this? Why do I want this? And usually, if we think about this hard enough and get curious enough about it, we'll find out. I want this because I think this will provide me this, or it'll make me feel this, or it'll allow me to be able to do this. Then if you take that next thing that you want, say, well, why do I want this? What you'll discover is that you want this because it'll provide you with this. And if you keep asking yourself that question about what you want over and over again, eventually you will get to the bottom of the mountain of wants. And what we will most often find at the bottom of the mountain of wants is that what we believe about what we want is that it will make us happy. Right? Because at the end of the day, we want happy. And not like happy hour happy, right? Not like the fleeting happiness that you have to keep going out and filling up over and over again, but the kind of happy that we mean when we say, I just want to be happy. Right? That kind of happiness. The happiness that allows us to finally rest and have peace and feel like we have enough. We can stop racing and sprinting because now we can just be happy. Like, that is the want behind all the wants. Now, here's the thing that we also know. We know this. That what we want, never quite gets us what we want to get. Right? What we want never quite gets us what we want to get. Those wants that we chase after, that ultimately promise to make us happy. Every want that we satisfy gives us that sense that we're a little bit closer, that happiness is, just so close now because I got that one, and now it's so close. And that distance between us and happiness is like each want gets us a little bit closer, but that little bit closer is just like this infinite distance away that we can never really quite cross. And it's like every want that gets fulfilled, happiness is still just a little bit out of reach. Happiness is still just a little bit further away. And every one that's satisfied gives us the sense of, but I'm just so close now. Like I'm within spitting distance. Like we're almost there, just a little bit further to shore. But it never quite gets us what we want. Does it? We know this. And those of us who may have walked out of or walked away or just chose to never walk into any version of faith to begin with because it came with requirements and expectations that got in the way of what you wanted to get, that walking away from that version of faith to get what you wanted to get. What we've discovered is that we never got what we wanted to get because it never get us to what we were trying to get. And what was so shocking and scandalous and simultaneously compelling about the version of faith that Jesus extended to his first century audience was that it was a version of faith that didn't have requirements and expectations. That it wasn't a version of faith that made demands. That it wasn't a version of faith that said, here's what you have to do in order to be approved. It was completely different. And that might not sound like the version of Christianity that you were presented with, right? Because maybe the version of Christianity that you were presented with was a version where there were lots of requirements and expectations. There are plenty of them. But when we look at what Jesus said, when we look at Jesus' teachings, we find that Jesus was offering something completely different. In fact, when we look at one of Jesus' longest recorded messages in the book of Matthew, because it was recorded by one of Jesus' eyewitness followers who spent Jesus' entire 3-year ministry walking with, talking with, learning from Jesus. And at the end of it, Matthew wrote it all down and passed it down through the church and was spread through the church. We find it today in the New Testament portion of our Bibles, Matthew's account of the life of his friend Jesus. And in that account, we find Jesus' longest recorded message. And we don't know if it's Jesus' longest message ever, or if it's just the longest one that was written down because it was just the day that Matthew happened to remember to bring pen and paper with him and he could actually get it all down. However it ended up, it's Jesus' longest recorded message, and it's probably one that you've heard of before because it's very popular. It's referred to often. It's Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, because it was a sermon that Jesus gave on the mountain, right? Perfect name. First sermon. Sermon on the Mount. So in the Sermon on the Mount, when you read the Sermon on the Mount, if you ever do, it's in Matthew, and it's chapters 5 through 7. in it, if we were to just skip over the beginning, and if we skipped out on the end, it would be so easy to read this sermon as a list of all of the requirements and expectations. It would be so easy to read it as this is what you have to do in order to be approved. If we just skip the beginning and the end. But if you read it that way, you would miss what made Jesus' teaching, what made it so shocking and so scandalous and yet so compelling to his first century audience. And so as Jesus stood on the mount that day, and he had started in the morning, and he had crowds of people who'd come to hear this teacher, crowds of people who traveled from miles around to come hear this teacher that they'd heard so much about. This teacher that they heard could perform miracles. This teacher that they heard taught things about God that nobody had ever taught before, who taught in ways that nobody had ever taught before, who healed people in ways that people had never been healed before. People traveled all around to hear this teacher that they'd heard so much about. So here are the crowds waiting to hear from Jesus. And there Jesus was on the mountain. Everybody's time. He just has this audience that's just enthralled, just waiting to hear what he has to say. And as they leaned in, as the sun continued to rise and burn off the cool of the morning, they leaned in. And Matthew tells us that Jesus said, here are the requirements and expectations. Right? You guys have read this before. You know that's how it starts. Jesus says, these are the requirements. No, that's not how it starts. Come on, guys. He says, here's what you have to do for God to be pleased with you. Listen up, everybody. I'm about to lay it down. Here's what you have to do so that God will be pleased. But that's not what he says. And you know this. Here's what he said. He said, blessed, which sounds like religious jargon, and it's so easy for us to read over blessed and just be like, yeah, religious mumbo jumbo. I don't know what that means. But for Jesus and for Jesus' first century audience, what that word, that Greek word that's translated blessed means, what they would have heard is the word happy. And not happy hour happy, but the kind of happiness that you mean when you say, I just want to be happy. Jesus said, happy are those who? Happy are those. Jesus was begging the question that everybody was asking. He was begging the question that all of us are asking. Jesus was asking it on our behalf. He was saying, hey, do you want to know who finds happiness? Because Jesus knows whether we're asking the question or not. He knows what we're all after. He knows what we're all looking for. He knows what's behind what we want to get. That at the bottom of what we want is that we want to be happy. And so Jesus starts out by saying, hey, do you want to know? Do you want to know who's happy? Do you want to know who discovers happiness? And everybody leaned in. And Jesus reads through this list. Happy are those who are poor in spirit. Happy are those who mourn. Happy are the meek. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Happy are the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted because of righteousness. He's like, this is who's happy. And his audience was so confused because these were not their models for happiness. Number one, they're confused. Number two, because why is Jesus talking about happiness? Right? Faith is supposed to make us good. It's not supposed to make us happy. Is it? And then Jesus walked through example after example after example. Jesus said, and this is how you get there. And he walked through, and you take this step, and you take this step. He's like, application after application after application. As the sun continued to rise in the sky and the dew continued to burn off from the morning, Jesus walked them through application after application of what it looks like to get there. And at the end of it, it had been so long, it would have been so easy for his audience to have walked away and to have thought that what they heard were the requirements and expectations of what they had to do for God to be pleased with them. And so before Jesus finished, as he turns the corner to wrap it all up, and he begins to bring the plane in for the landing, Jesus brings them back all in again to explain to them why he's explained this to them. And here's what he says. He says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. Say, look. Remember how we started this? Remember how we started with the question, who discovers happiness? Remember? Say, listen, everybody's traveling down the road to happiness that is the road of just a little bit more, just a little bit farther, just a little bit more to go. It's like everybody thinks that's the way to happiness. That's why you see everybody going in that direction. Everybody thinks that's the way to happiness. It's like, but it's not. It's not, because if you follow that way to happiness, it leads to destruction. It will exhaust you, because you'll never get there. It will wear you out. It'll tear you down. It'll do damage to you. It'll do damage to the people around you, because it'll never actually get you there. That what you're trying to get will never get you what you're trying to get. It'll end up destroying you. She said, instead, the small gate. Small is the gate, and narrow is the road that leads to life. The life that we're looking for, the vitality, that happy life, the life where you finally say, I can rest. I have peace. I can be content right here. The fullness of life that we're all seeking. He says, the road's narrow that leads to what it is that you are trying to get. And only a few find it. He said, listen. So, what I'm giving you, what I've just explained to you, and all of these applications that we just went through, are not requirements and expectations that are going to get in the way of what you're trying to get. No. What I'm giving you is an invitation into the way that will get you to where it is that you are trying to get. It is not through the things that you think you need to get there. In fact, those things will never get you there. You know this. What I am giving you is an invitation into the way, to get into the way that will ultimately lead you to what it is you're trying to get. It's not expectations that get in the way of. Jesus was giving invitations that get you in the way toward life. The life that you're looking for. The life that you're hungry for. Jesus wasn't giving requirements and expectations. He was giving invitations. And Jesus' invitation was not to follow rules, not to follow requirements, but to follow him. And because it was so difficult for everybody to get their mind around that, Jesus said, if we had to reduce follow me to following rules, we'll reduce it to one rule. Love God and love others. And those of us who are good at math would all say, but wait, that's two. And Jesus would say, because the way that God is inviting you to love him is by loving others. And the night before his crucifixion, he would sit down with his closest disciples for one last meal. And Jesus would look across the table at them, look right in their eyes and say, a new command I give you, one command I give you. Love one another. To which they'd say, that's not new. And Jesus would say, but I'm not through. Love one another as I have loved you. And within 24 hours, as I have loved you would mean something brand new. That Jesus would go to the cross and demonstrate the unconditional, self-sacrificial love of God. And he looked at his followers right in the eye. He said, the rest of the world, the whole rest of the world will know that you are my disciples, my followers. They'll know that you follow me by how you love one another. That the way that Jesus is inviting us into is the way of love. That following Jesus is following Jesus in the way of love. And Jesus' promise is that if you follow me in my way of love, you will find what you're looking for, what you're longing for, what you're running after, and all those other things. It's right here. You find it in the way of love because it's the way of life. It's the way life was created to work. It's the way life is meant to work. It's the way that you were created to live. And when you get in the way of love, you discover what it is that all along you've been trying to get. Because Jesus' way of love is the way toward what we're all trying to get. And over the next several weeks, we're going to be walking through Jesus' sermon and walking through the application after application that Jesus gives of things that aren't meant to be requirements and expectations that get in the way of what it is we're trying to get, but invitations to get in the way, to get us in the way towards what it is that we're all of us are trying to get, the things that bring us happiness in the life we're all looking for, to experience life the way we long to experience, to engage in our lives the way we all long to engage in our lives. We would love for you guys to continue with us, to come back next week as we continue on our journey together of getting in the way. Will you guys pray with me? Father, we are so grateful for you, for just wanting to come to us so humbly, with so much grace and mercy, to invite us just to follow you, just to walk with you, to learn your way of love. And I just pray over us as individuals and over us as a community, as we begin this journey together, just to sit at your feet and learn from you how to walk in alignment, how to get in the way of your love, to discover the life you created us for, the life that you long to see us live out and enjoy. And we're just so thankful for you, and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.